I'm really excited to give this presentation. It's going to kind of give an overview of some of my thoughts of what's going on. I'm taking a little bit of a different approach than you might have had before as a psychiatrist and someone who is in the trenches every day. So we'll go through some of the data on opiates, fentanyl, which is, if you haven't heard of that, you will soon, suicide, and reasons there may kind of societal reasons that all of these things may be contributing. So we know, and you just had a good lecture, I imagine this is kind of a review if you were in the last one, but especially in this 18 to 25 group, there is this increase in serious psychological distress. And it's not just in the US, it's also in England. And this is a graph of major depression. You can see both in the 12 to 17 and 18 to 25, it's been going up. Here's a big graph. I don't know if you really need to look at all these numbers, but the basic idea is that specifically plans have been going up in this younger age group, just within a short amount of time even. And here's another one about at least one suicide-related outcome, thoughts, plans, attempts. Once again, that's really going up for that 18 to 25-year-old group. So the number of ED visits have gone up. So we had a ED physician, are you still in here, who was talking about, yep, seeing a lot of these patients, right, with psychological issues hitting the emergency department. And completed suicides has gone up significantly, 56% in this young age group. Here's the mean well-being from hours of gaming, smartphones, and computer use. Did she show you this slide or something similar? This is interesting because you can see the mean well-being decreases after about 2 hours. So if you have kids at home, 2 hours max, right? That's what I say to my wife. No more, like that. And we try to have media fasts. Once again, electronic use and depression. Now, it's not clear why this is going up after 2 hours, but it is. Are people who are depressed at home on their screens more? Maybe. Are those people who are depressed acting in such a way that is like utilizing this in a different way? Yep. Okay. At the same time, we have this prescription epidemic, and the first phase was the increase in the sales, and subsequently you have the increase in death. And we can think of it in really 3 phases. Have you guys heard of the 3 phases before? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, I don't want to teach you guys something you already know. It looks like no one has heard of this. That's good. Okay, so the first phase was prescription opiates. Boom, hitting the market, okay? The second phase was heroin, and the third phase is fentanyl and fentanyl derivatives. So you have these 3 phases, prescription opiates increasing, and then all of a sudden, heroin hits the market. Have you guys, any of you read about why the heroin at this time was hitting the market in the way it was? Yeah. There's a wonderful book that documents it called Dreamland. I highly recommend it. And it talks about how there was essentially the distribution channels from Mexico just opened up and flooded the market. And you had individual sellers coming to people's houses. And you had this sort of, it moved away from this big cartel to little family units. And so they put these bags of heroin in their mouth. If a cop pulls them over, they swallow it. They only travel with so many at a time. And it really did just escalate the amount of heroin and the ability to get clean heroin. And the heroin that they were bringing was the black tar heroin, the very pure heroin. So then what happened is you can see the spike of synthetic drugs. And so this is fentanyl. And this has not hit on the West Coast like it has hit on the East Coast. And we're going to see a huge increase. But even now, we've had deaths. And whenever I have someone who dies of opiates, and the family comes into my office and they're grieving the loss of the loved one, inevitably, fentanyl is either not known about, but was the culprit, or was the culprit. And I'm going to talk about the reason. So the first wave, Purdue Pharmacy, huge lawsuit. You have people like David Proctor, who had this huge mill. I mean, if you read about this guy, it is just devastating to our field that this guy wasn't, gotten rid of a long time before and then it's just devastating. He would sleep with his patients. He was abusing the system, just this incredible pill mill. And then he would hire other physicians, and he had this memory issue that he eluded the law for a number of years. And at the same time, you have like places like Purdue Pharmacy creating these very strong, very addicting things. And initially, they tell physicians, this is not addicting. Well, we know now, everyone who gets put on an opiate for a long period of time gets addicted. You get at least a physiological dependence on this, okay? And so here you have sales of oxycodone in pounds, okay? So you can literally see the pound increase per year, right? And so somewhere around 2008, it just keeps going up and up and up. And there's only been a slight reduction lately, and a 400% increase from 2002 to 2013. Isn't that just astronomical to think about? And then you have the second wave, heroin. Okay, we talked about that. And then the third wave is fentanyl. So if you look at this picture, this is how much of an overdose will kill you. So heroin's this much, fentanyl's this much, carfentanyl's this much. The point being, like, can you imagine a drug dealer trying to titrate this stuff? Like, would you trust that guy? Okay, so I like thought to myself naively that, like, okay, people are going to hear about how this is killing people, and they're going to want to stop this, right? They're going to want to get test strips from Amazon. You can get fentanyl test strips. Do you know what happens instead? When someone dies of fentanyl, everyone looks to get some of that stash from the drug dealer. It's going to be a killer high. No joke. From a patient, out of his mouth, to me, a couple months ago. Okay. So here's the national trends of fentanyl seizures. And we can see that fentanyl, the green one right here, is going up and up and up and up and up. So the seizure data is huge, okay? And it's so cheap. It's like so cheap, dirt cheap. You can get it UPS'd through the black market to your doorstep. It's not just one big cartel drug dealer. No, this is literally like hundreds of thousands of tiny drug dealers just doing small orders, cryptocurrency from China. It's actually legal to make this in China. Okay? And then you have where it's happening. So northeast is the hardest, next Midwest, west, south. So we're going to see on the west a huge increase. That's my guess, because it's just supply and demand and the cost. Okay, so we're having some progress in opiates grip, but not very much. The death is higher now than suicide. Opiate deaths are higher than suicide. So we're getting 47,000 deaths per year in 2017. It's probably going to continue to increase in my estimation. Suicides are around the same amount, a little bit less. This is about 1% of the population. Okay? 1% of the population will die by opiate overdose. So, it comes back to my question. Why are opiates increasing? Why are suicides increasing? And so I went on a quest to try to figure it out and try to dispel some of the myths. Okay? Is it genes? Now, we know that if you move from a dizygotic to a monozygotic and your twin committed suicide, you go from about a 2% chance that you as the twin will commit suicide to a 4%, to a 6% chance. It's an absolute 4% risk increase of committing suicide. So somewhat genetically linked, but a lot is going on, right? Does that make sense? Only 4% increase, absolute, from dizygotic, same environment, same womb environment, different set of genes, same parents, to monozygotic, same genes, same womb environment, same house environment. Okay. Also, if you have sexual abuse in your childhood, if you have a rape, some of these really severe types of things, your increase in suicidality goes up 4 times. So you can think about this, if you take that group of population that experienced that, instead of 1% dying, it goes up to 4%. Okay, so 4% of the people who have severe abuse will die by suicide. I looked at adverse childhood experiences. We know as the adverse childhood experiences go up, so greater than 4, you have increased substance abuse, so 14%, compared to 6.5, you have increase in early intercourse, increase in promiscuity, increase in sexual dissatisfaction, increase in panic, depression, anxiety. And you can see the numbers here. It doubles or triples sometimes, the incidence of these things. So we know that adverse childhood experiences are going on. I wanted to look at where these are going on. I found a nice little graph of where they're going on, so you can see what parts of the U.S. have higher adverse childhood experiences. And here you can see 2 or more. You can see the average 2 or more childhood adverse experiences, and then you can see where these are happening more and where they're happening less. And I was thinking, is that related to suicidality? So I looked at the suicide rate in some of these different states, and I was thinking, is this the link? And the states that have the highest suicide rate, interesting, California doesn't have the highest suicide rate. So you can look at even between states, right? It tends to be places that are impoverished, that are poor, where there's more rural, sort of, different places like that have the highest rate. And so maybe that could be a contributing factor for some, right? But is that really increasing over the years? I couldn't find that data. I wish I could, and I wish I could look at state by state compared to the suicide, and there's no database to merge these files to look at this stuff, unfortunately, at this time. So looked at the VA. Now, if someone in the VA is just a veteran, that increases the rate of suicide about 3 times. Someone who is a veteran that uses drugs or alcohol, that increases it about 7 times, okay? And so that also is another thing that can help kind of the big picture of what we're looking at here. How does the environment change genes? Now we know that the environment does change genes, and so early life adversity, altered DNA methylation and histone modification. Suicide is associated with widespread changes in methylation patterns of neurotrophic factors, neuroprotective factors, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. If you're in here the hour below, some of that lifestyle stuff is part of what's going on. Some will say more, are the medications the cause? Okay, I've heard that. I'm in, because I have a podcast, I get these trolls, internet trolls who drop all sorts of, every mass shooter was on an SSRI. That's just not true. See these people, and then they propagate these ideas, and so antidepressants have increased, antipsychotics have increased, psychotherapy has decreased, which is unfortunate, but that's largely a facet of insurance. And benzos have increased slightly, not by psychiatrists, actually more by primary care docs. SSRIs increasing, okay. So hormones have not increased over this time period, because I'm thinking to myself, is it something that we're not thinking about, right? Corticosteroids have not increased. Here's a meta-analysis looking at antidepressants. We know that antidepressants do increase suicidal thinking. It's not been shown to increase the execution of suicide itself, but we know that it can increase the thoughts from 2% in the placebo to 4% in the group taking the antidepressants. This is well documented. I think some of this might be akathisia, some of it might be anxiety, so monitoring of them, especially when they start the antidepressants, is very important. If your primary care doc, don't wait to see them 3 months after you start an antidepressant. See them back in a week or 2 weeks, a couple times to keep watching them. Okay, so are meds the problem? I asked myself that question, and then I came to this statistic, which was just oh, okay, maybe not. 3/4 of suicide in England are of those who were not receiving mental health care at all. That's interesting, right? So maybe it's not what we're doing. Maybe it's a lack of treatment for a lot of these people. And guess who gets the worst percentage actually going to get treatment? Guess who has the worst percentage of actually going to get treatment? It's the co-occurring acute mental illness plus substance use disorder. 90% are in no treatment. And who is the most likely patient to engage treatment? High trait conscientiousness. Who's the most likely to use drugs? Low trait conscientiousness. Why? People who are very conscientious, like probably a lot of you in here, are thinking about the future, planning the future, very goal-directed, right? People with very low conscientiousness are very in the moment, pleasure-seeking, gratification-seeking. And so sometimes it's like if you have high conscientiousness and if you have high trait agreeableness and you come into my office and you say, Dr. Puder, what do? I say, go to a partial program, go to a day treatment program. Okay, I'll do it. Okay, now imagine you're low conscientiousness and low trait agreeableness and you come into my office. If you come into my office, right? Because you usually don't. You're going to be less like, you're going to like argue back, like, I don't want to do this, you know, and it's hard to get these types of people into treatment. Okay. So white people actually take a lot more meds than non-whites. Okay, so another question is, how do we rate compared to other countries, right, in suicide? And Russia is actually quite a bit higher than the US, so it's about twice as high. So you have some other countries that have quite, double the rate of suicide over the whole country. So putting that, I think that helps me put things into perspective as well. It's like, okay, we want to make this better. We want to improve things. But maybe it's not completely a US problem. Okay. Here's the high opiate death states, so you can see where those are. The darker ones have higher opiate deaths. And this is looking at suicide rate. This is suicide rate up here, so the dark states are more suicide. So you get that kind of in that dark area here. And what that was, it's similar actually if you look at the ACE states, the higher percentage of adverse childhood experiences. And also in this, I was looking at treatment. And treatment is actually the highest in places like California, but you have the lowest suicide rate. So it doesn't make sense to think that treatment is actually the problem. Okay. One thing we know, suicide, like people who actually kill themselves, they have a sick brain. And by sick brain, I mean, like if you autopsy thousands of these people, they have different brains than the control. So people who commit suicide have lower BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Okay, that's like Miracle-Gro for the brain. They have lower serotonin breakdown products in their CSF. They have lower serotonin transporter binding. They have changes in their cortical thickness. They have lower gray matter volume in their temporal cortex. They have reductions in their orbital frontal cortex, temporal cortex. Okay? And so we know these people have sick brains. So, where does a sick brain start? This is a very startling picture of 2 3-year-olds, one with severe neglect, one without severe neglect. Can you notice the difference? This is the severe neglect. And so we know that brain development, like the connection, the interaction, is so important those first 3 years of life. I think that in this extreme neglect, we're looking like literally at like, one caregiver in a third world orphanage to like 30 kids, and just like inability to give that basic caregiving. Okay. If you are getting help to raise your kids, don't feel shame. For your grandparents, this is a good slide to show your kids about being a grandparent. It's like in the olden days, we used to have tons of people around our kids helping them. And over time, there's a decrease in that sort of village mentality. So we have less and less people raising our kids. In the inner city, there's very tragic details about how much screen time they're raised with. Very tragic details. And they've actually, Bruce Perry, this guy, he's actually plotted how much time they spend with real interactions with real people. And it's like quite a bit, it's like tragic. The amount of real contact. I mean, my kids have so much contact with me and the real human, and we jump on the trampoline, and it's just not the case for some kids. So maybe that's getting worse. You know, maybe that's part of the problem. Prevalence of marijuana has gone up. Here's a significant increase in 2017, 15% increase, especially in this sort of 18 to 25-year-old range. It's been going up. And if they are using marijuana, they continue to use it in pregnancy. This is a tragic increase, actually. Look, it's going up from 2015 to 2017 from 3% to 7%. And there's big problems with marijuana on those fetuses. No drug dealer or dispensary is going to tell them the side effects like a good physician will, right? And sometimes I have very little success convincing people. So I made 2 podcast episodes, and if they'll listen to them, I can usually convince them because the data is just very strong. If they use opiates, they're very likely to use other drugs. THC content. Do you know this? That the THC has gone up over time? So this is a fun one when they say, but THC is all natural, man. It's all natural from the earth. I don't want your drugs. I just want what's natural. That's what they say. And then I say, hey, but did you know that the THC content has gone up over time? So it's no longer natural. It's genetically modified. You are having GMO marijuana, 100%, okay? And I show them this graph, and it goes, 4%. It used to be 4%. It used to be less than that. So in the 60s, what you were smoking back in the day, if you were smoking, probably not. But if you were, that's not what they're smoking today. They're smoking like something that's like literally, magnitudes stronger. Okay, depression and cannabis is linked. This is undeniable. So all these studies show that depression and cannabis, suicidality in cannabis is linked. Co-occurring substance use, suicidality, if they're using substances, it puts them at greater danger, just like I showed you in that VA study. Increased risk of psychosis with cannabis use. I did a whole breakdown of this. After I released my first podcast episode on marijuana, I got so much emails, feedback from clinicians too. Like people who are smart people, they're like, what about pesticides? Is pesticides what's causing the increase in depression, increase in psychosis? I was like, I don't know. So I looked it up. You know what I found about pesticides? They are sometimes neurotoxic, but look at this graph. This shows that this isn't the one that proves the pesticide thing. The one that proves the pesticide is really that the higher potency THC causes more psychosis. So if you can get a young person who demands to smoke marijuana onto a pure CBD, good on you. The CBD might have its own issues, but it's better than the high potency THC. And what we're seeing more and more in the psych department is wax. A dubbing, like they're using they're basically using high potency THC, like 50, 60% wax THC. They're getting this stuff online, they smoke it, really, really bad. Okay, if high potency marijuana were no longer available, 12.2% of first episode psychosis cases would be prevented. 30% less in London, 50% in Amsterdam. And so they'll also say to me, oh, these are all US studies backed by pharma, they're not real. I'm like, look, these are going on in Europe. These are multinational studies done without conflicts of interest. And at that point, they're like, oh, I don't understand what you're saying. Your kids eat sugar, sugar's the real culprit. Okay, maybe it's, okay. Real conversations, guys. Suicide increases on drugs. So we know that various drugs increase the risk of suicidality. One data point that I saw that was a little bit disturbing was that physicians are something like 20 times more likely to use benzos who actually ended up killing themselves. They found the benzos in the autopsy. They also found higher antipsychotics. 50% of physicians who committed suicide were under some sort of the influence. So, we're not, and it's not uncommon for me to treat a physician nowadays who got addicted to some type of opiate, because we have incredible access. It's like Justin Bieber just became a Christian, and he said, "I'm not cheating on my wife." And everyone's like, "Oh, okay, good." Do you realize how much access he has to options? You have no idea, right? He's literally in that world with anyways. So as physicians, do you realize how much access we have and knowledge? I mean, it's that's why we get addicted. Okay. So this is meth, how meth changes the brain after use. It's sad. It tends to be that the meth addicts will come into the psychiatric hospital, they crash for 3 days, they yell at the staff, they sleep in their bed, we don't bother them very much, and then they get out. They get very irritable and very jumpy and paranoid. Okay, meth capital of the world here, guys. San Bernardino, high desert, OPCs and mental health. So there was this was kind of an interesting deep dive I did into oral contraceptives. And it does seem that oral contraceptives can increase the risk of depression and first hospitalization. Now this is a large scale study, so there might be other reasons to still put people on OCPs. But the incident does go up, and it's worse with a pure progesterone. And do you know what the time scale is? Let's say you had a patient who came in, new onset depression, and they started their contraceptives 3 years ago. But their depression started 3 months ago. What do you think? Risk? Not at all. Now, if they started it, if about 3 months to about, the peak is about 6 months. So if you started that 6 months prior, and then they're seeing you in their office 6 months after starting the pill, and they have depression when they didn't have it before, that's who I would be suspicious of. But it doesn't seem to be going up, and so I don't think OCPs are what's causing the mental health issue in the US. This is probably one of the most telling studies I've seen. Mental health correlation, and this is the correlation with happiness. So the correlations are pretty small, but if you think about a population effect, I think they can impact quite a bit. And so you can see sports and exercise, positive correlation, in-person social interaction, positive, religious services, positive, print media, somewhat positive. The things that are not positive tends to be this screen time. And I think it's because there's something about in-person interaction, which is, our brains were just made for that, And so think about the activities, sports and religious activities, and how that's declined, and how that sort of natural place of in-person interactions has decreased. So, in-person interaction has decreased. Mental pain and meaning. So this one study found that mental pain increased, meaning decreased. And meaning of life is correlated with suicidal tendency. So we have some smaller studies linking this. We have meaning of life and risk of suicidality correlated. Pretty strongly, actually. That's a 0.82. And locus of control. What comes first? Does the suicidality come first, or does the lack of meaning come first? Good question. Higher locus of control is related to higher purpose. And so suicidality is actually the lowest in high Catholic and Muslim countries. 6.5 per 100,000. Remember, in the US it's about 14. Now, I'm curious how accurate this is, because if there's so much stigma around suicide, are you going to report that? But at the same time, if you look at South Korea, they have a very sort of more lenient view on suicidality, and theirs is very high. So it's like an option in their culture. It's more of an option than it's stigmatized. So I think belief systems do influence the suicidality rate. If those who attend church are 4 times less likely, more or less likely, to commit suicide. Okay. So we have a trend in spirituality decreasing over the last 50 years. And it continues to decrease. So this is a recent table on how Christian, you can see it 2007 versus 2014, it's gone down 7 points. The unaffiliateds have gone up. Non-Christian faith has gone up a little bit. This is another one of those. So we have, specifically, this is of U.S. adults. This is of millennials. And so Christian has gone down in millennials. The unaffiliated has gone up. And there's this large generation gap in American religion, where the boomers and it seems that there's a change going on in our culture, following, similar to what happened in Europe, probably, the secularization. The religious nuns have gone up by 30 million over the past decade. Okay. We know that those who use positive religious coping have less drug and alcohol use. And if you look at the Latter-day Saint population, specifically, I'm not LDS, but this is a good study, they found that those who were active LDS had 9 per 100,000. Those who were inactive, 41, and those non-LDS, 62. Specifically, this is the Utah males. Now, this begs the question, is it just LDS preserving them, or is there something about being an outsider that's hard in Utah? Because we know that the majority of people are Mormon. So here's more data on that. Okay, this is one of the most powerful studies on how your thoughts about God change your mortality. They did a 2-year study at Duke. It was very well done. And those who wondered whether God had abandoned them or questioned God's love for me or felt punished by God for my lack of devotion had increased risk of all-cause mortality. How much? 28%, 22%, or 16%, based on those 3 questions. The most powerful being wondered whether God had abandoned me. And this was after controlling for variables. So this was all-cause mortality. There's something about how we view our ideas, I think, influence our whole body. Our whole body gets influenced by our ideas, by our beliefs, right? There's also, you may see this push in the world of ideas on YouTube and towards determinism. You have no choice. You are just a consequence of your biology, of your environment. You have no choice. You have no free will. Well, so they took groups of students, and they had one group read this paper that sort of tried to convince them that we were just a product of our genes, our environment. We really didn't have any choice, right? And then the other group, they had them read something just boring. And then they stuck them into a group of different tasks, economic games and stuff. And those who were primed with the thought that they had no choice, that they were just a product of their genes, their environment, they were more likely to cheat, they were more likely to conform to social norms, they had reduced helping behavior and increased aggression, and they did not slow down after making an error to reevaluate. That's a frontal lobe function. That's people with ADHD also have that issue. And so they had decreased frontal lobe function just from being primed that they were determined without a choice, just genetics, just environment. That's why I showed you that prior data that even if your monozygotic twin committed suicide, that would only increase your chance of committing suicide by 4%. Even if you had a traumatic childhood, that would only increase your chance of committing suicide 4 times. So from going from 1% of the population to 4% of the population. So suicide is not just genes and environment. Yes, there is changes in the brain on autopsy, and that's important to note because treatment is so necessary. So you can't just tell someone who's severely suicidal, buck up, overcome it, right? There's actual physiologic change and damage, and alcohol and drugs also making that much worse, okay? So meaning and purpose changes the way we view stress. So if rats were forced to do exercise, they actually increased stress markers that were bad for them, and they didn't have a change in a positive way of their brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If they voluntarily did it, their BDNF increases, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Remember, on autopsy, BDNF was decreased. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor, miracle grow for the brain is a good thing. Being able to choose to suffer versus having no choice. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Viktor Frankl said, "The way in which man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. It may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human indignity and become no more than an animal." And there are a lot of ideologies out there that are making us no more than an animal. And those are on the increase. Viktor Frankl also said, "We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." It's very important to hold on to that, I think, especially in dire circumstances that we go through, especially in the suffering that we go through. Have any of you heard of the word incel? One person. Okay. This is a phenomenon. This is an example of a phenomenon that's going on in the past couple years. Like this is a 2020 article here. And it shows, so incels, involuntary, celibate. They are men who believe that they have no chance of ever connecting sexually with a female. They've been rejected maybe a couple times, maybe a lot of times, but they feel like they have no chance of ever meeting a mate. And from that viewpoint, there's like all these YouTube videos, and they become sort of enraptured in this very deterministic worldview. I'm just my genes, I'm just my looks, they're not attracted to me, so I can never get a mate. Individual commenters on these videos have gone up a ton. Literally to like, we're talking about 1 million people commenting, individual users commenting on these videos, on these incel videos. We know that there's a couple mass shooters who are linked to and who espouse this ideology of incels. There's a ton, like if you get into this, there's a ton of cognitive distortions that these people believe. But it's very misogynistic, it's very anti-female, there's an anger, and they're taking away their own responsibility, and they're putting a lot of victimhood on themselves. These are the words that they use if they did this analysis of the words in the comments and stuff, and so you can kind of see the words that they use. And so with mass shooting, linking it to what we're already talking about, there's 4 common factors that they found. This was a recent analysis done of all mass shooting in the past like 50 years. There's early childhood trauma and violence. Maybe they saw someone commit suicide. Maybe they were seeing domestic violence. There's this crisis point, this point they get to in their life. Maybe there was a girl that rejected them, or a work situation like in San Bernardino where there was some sort of work stuff. But then also there's a radical ideology, and this is key. This is absolutely key. Radical ideology, like that incel ideology, a belief structure, complex, validating their behavior. This is like radical jihadists, right? Why do they do mass shootings? It's a very complex, rigid belief structure that rewards them. It's the same thing for our homegrown terrorists, but we're just not looking at this like incel phenomenon and thinking about like, okay, there are these different places on the web that you can go and you can start believing ideas. It's the ideas that lead to the desperation. And a lot of it is a very deterministic worldview. I can't make a choice that will lead to a change. And so we need to, when we sit down with these young people who are struggling with ideas, we have to realize this is part of what's going on. We're in an ideological war. We're in a war of ideas. We're much more complex than just, simple genes and environment. 80% of mass shooters in schools got their weapons from family members. So this is another thing. If you have any suspicion with any of your patients, how is it locked up? And then, like I tried to hide Hatchimals from my daughter, and she went up and got them, like up on the very, very top of the kitchen counter. Like, so don't think you can put it high enough for your kids to not get it, even at the age of like, she's 5. Okay. Low empathy leads to more complications for diabetes. This is a group of low-tier family docs, middle-tier family docs, and high-tier empathy family docs. And the high-tier empathy family doctors had about 1/2 the diabetic complications. And this is a nice study of 20,000 patients. So this was showing that like empathy is not just helping in psychiatry, right? It's not just helping in mental health. Empathy is actually really important if you're a primary care doc. One way of decreasing your empathy is staring at your screen. Unfortunately, we got to take notes and we got to stare at screens from time to time. But I teach my residents, try to focus your attention on the patient. That just even focusing your attention, getting out of your own head into their head is so important. This is for psychotherapy. You want to know how to refer someone to a good psychotherapist? I have people, parents always tell me, oh, who's the best CBT doctor around? Or who's the best this, right? Well, they're actually finding that it's treatment differences like CBT versus psychodynamic versus EMDR versus DBT, all these treatment differences, the effect size of those differences is actually pretty small. Whereas things like alliance, that's the connection you have with the patient, empathy, goal consensus, those are really high. The effect size is really high. Effect size is how many standard deviations this moves from the mean, from the control group to the active group. So these are moving away from each other. So, summary, and then we'll get to some questions. Opiate use is linked to polysubstance abuse, which correlates with MDD and suicidality. So as we see an increase in opiate use, I think we're also seeing now an increase in both the pathology of the parents and the kids, because we know what happens when the parents are strung out on drugs to the kids. There's just so much more chance for abuse and neglect. Secondly, psychopharm and therapy, I think, are really important to heal a broken brain. I think it's part of what helps. Okay, I didn't get into it. I took out my slides because I had too many already. But exercise, diet, helpful, I think, for part of this picture in healing the brain. Exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's one study from Duke that showed that it was as good as one antidepressant for moderate depression. Okay, and that was an exercise group, 3 days a week with a group of people. So maybe the group effect had some influence as well. Diet, Mediterranean diet seems to be the most studied at this point. There's a lot of nuance there. And community and connection, right? Looking at those slides of decreased screen time, increase in actual time relating to another human being is so important to get back to who we are. And then the last point, belief systems may be a key factor we're missing. And this may be the big thing that we're going to see and be fighting against. And so, for me, how I think about this and how I'm approaching it is I am on every social media site. I have a small staff, and I have a private clinic which funds this small staff. And so I have an Instagram, a Facebook, a Twitter, a TikTok. Probably most of you don't even know what TikTok is, but there's like 80 million users, I think, right now. And I have 80,000 followers on TikTok. So I'm really out there on social media trying to educate the population. I also have my podcast. I think we're at about 500,000 downloads in the last year. And it's called the Psychiatry and Psychotherapy Podcast. So I'm trying to do things to educate this next generation of mental health professionals and people who are in this field on how to approach this and how to help. But I think the more we can get out this message, the better. So I'm going to open it up to questions at this point.
Thank you very much, David. Very, very thought-provoking. I'm wondering about the study with the rats, and I'm just thinking about the rats that voluntarily exercise versus those who were forced. I'm doing the LA Marathon on Sunday, so I'm just thinking about that.
Choice.
Questions?
You choose to wake up every morning to practice.
Yeah.
Focus on that.
Questions?
Thanks, Dr. Puder, for that presentation. That was a ton of info, man.
Dude, I'm sorry.
But a lot to think about. Did you come to a conclusion as to why because you began the presentation saying, why is depression on an increase? Did you answer your own question after all your research?
I think it has to do with belief structures. I think it's more complicated than a lot of the simple things. I think it has to do with what people believe changes the meaning and the purpose and their self. Can I be a mover in my life? Can I actually make decisions to make my life better? And I think when I see this kind of trend towards determinism in the YouTubes and the things which young people are consuming, and towards away from anything spiritual, and then from that they're having less places to congregate, to connect. And so I think it's a combination of less actual human connection and increase in viewpoints and worldviews that will propagate a more depressive and more sort of depressogenic world.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. You sound like I mean, to me, I find that fascinating, of course, as a Christian. But what are other people saying about this? I imagine there's very, very few people who are saying that. Are there has anyone else delved into that question? What did they come up with?
I see, and I think this is fairly. I mean, I think there's threads of it. I think if you look at some of the voices in our culture, there's a great intellectual, Jordan Peterson, who is a PhD level, professor, and why was he so popular? And I think it's because he was speaking to some of these issues that we're talking about, and I think he was saying hey, clean your room, take some small steps in your life, because the small steps can create meaning, and you can continue to rise up. But I think there's a lot of other voices, and so I think it's complicated, and I don't know if anyone's saying exactly the way that I said it, but I'm sure there'll be more.
Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, yes. You mentioned a study which involved some Israeli subjects. Was there any demarcation between whether they were Orthodox or they were secular?
I don't think so. Not in this
Okay.
study. I don't remember that.
All right.
Another question here.
I'm very much interested in the aspect about religion and suicide. And you spoke about the LDS Church, and this is at this moment is a very serious concern of theirs. And almost by definition, if you commit suicide, you're not active in the church. And so I'd like to have your feedback on that, because if you look at the map, it seems like the Bible Belt is an area where there is a lot of suicide in our nation. Now, it also is connected with a lot of other types of problems. But the question I have, it seems like that empathy, care, mercy, that sort of thing
Yeah.
is associated with a good outcome.
Yep.
But it turns out, believe it or not, that all Christians are not empathetic. In fact, many of them are considered critical. They are constantly criticizing other people, putting them down. Condescension is a very common problem. And particularly among transsexuals and homosexual community, that's not widely accepted among Christians. And so that maybe, I'm just trying to get a sense of what your balance about this, because in my looking at it, it seems like in some circumstances, religion makes that suicide rate much higher. And in other circumstances, it makes it lower.
This is a complex question, and first of all, are there unhealthy spiritual practices? Absolutely, 100%. I mean, there's a lot of people who are, wounded in the church. People who are, I know a bunch who were like chronically suicidal, and then they developed a kind of a rigid structure. It seems kind of rigid to me, but it's a rigid belief structure that allowed them to kind of pull out of that lower level of function. What I would say is, if you look at what are the things in spirituality which are positive across the board, things like forgiveness, things like the practice of forgiveness, there's a ton of research on how it actually is helpful. So I think we need to even educate the Christian church on like, hey, let's focus our attention on these things, and let's see that if some of the other focus might not be as important. Now, on the other hand, though, I do think that there is a place for having a polemic, having apologetics, having a debate or a discussion of ideas. It's happening. It's not like it isn't happening. And if you have bad ideas, I think that is part of the problem. So the question is, how can we have a discussion without unnecessarily offending people, or remaining open to learn and for it to be bidirectional?
Another question in the middle here.
Yeah, the Adventist Health Study has a lot of data. Has anybody collected the data on suicide in that study? Since most or many of us, at least, are Adventist here, might be even more relevant than the average Christian. And one other question in that is that if you have let's say a media and entertainment industry that are at least at some points somewhat hostile to religion, does that suggest that maybe they may be contributing to the epidemic?
I mean, of course, media. I mean, it's hard not to watch like a night show where they don't make fun of religion in some way, and I think that speaks to our need as intellectuals to be out in the domain, having the conversations that are important. There's so much nuance here, and it's hard. The Adventist Health Study talks about depression and diet and stuff like that, and it links it. And I wonder, when I look at those studies, if people who are more vegetarian or vegan show up to church more, and if that community effect is really the uncontrollable variable that then leads to the better outcomes. You see what I mean? There's something about being a part of a clan, being a part of a group, and in the LDS study, to come back to that one, it was the people who were the outsiders now that were the ones suffering. And so there will always be marginalized groups, and we need to have a special love and care for those groups, and find ways of maybe extending the love, but in the community. And it's hard when there's rigid beliefs around certain things that lead to maybe not extending that to some marginalized groups. I think there's an idea of like, there's something about a close-knit group that is powerfully good for mental health. When you have a close community, it's just wonderful, So how can we create community, and how, if you're leaders in your churches or in your organizations, how can we create more community, more collegiality, and stuff like that? One of the things I found in looking at how connected a medical student or resident felt with their attending, one of the big variables was empathy and psychological safety and feedback. But one of the ones that came up in our qualitative analysis was attendings and residents that fed them had much higher scores. Now, why is that the case? You feed someone, it actually brings them into a parasympathetic state, rest and relaxation. You know, you have to be able to digest that food. It also is caring for the person in front of you, right? So simple hospitality goes a very long way. After I gave that lecture to a dermatology group, I had a medical student come up to me and said, a month later, and said, I had the best month of my life. I was fed all the time. They didn't know my name before, now they know my name.
Thank you very much, David. That was a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.